Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my very special guest, Amy Fischer, former member of William Branham's Message. Amy, it's good to have you on here and to share your story. We've chatted a bit, via the Facebook chats, and we tried to make this connect, and I've had a couple weeks of just crazy busy, but we finally are connected, and good to have you on here. Maybe if you could start and just tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
My name is Amy Fischer. I live in a small town in Ohio. I'm 52 years old. I have a blended family, so we have 4 boys, 6 grandchildren, which keep us extremely busy. So we had a pretty good life here, small town USA.
Awesome. I've made many trips into small town Ohio. My wife's family's from Ohio, so we go up to Amish country used to go several times a year. Now it's about once a year, but love it up there. So what brought you into the Message? My
parents. Yep. Give a little background. When I was extremely small, my parents did not, I'm the oldest of 3 girls, was born in 1971. My parents did not go to church. I think it was around the time my youngest sister was born, they started going to a Baptist church. And that's where we first started out in this process. Went to Baptist church. We went to the Baptist school, 1st and 2nd grade. Everything seemed fine. My parents seemed normal. My dad and mom, they were Sunday school teachers. My dad drove a bus for the church. I was in the choir. They seemed to be very active. Mom did mission work. From what I remember, everything seemed, we had a normal couple years. Then I'm not real sure what happened. Dad didn't like some of the teachings, so we he took us out of the Baptist Christian school there and put us into a Wesleyan private Christian school with a Wesleyan church. And it was about that time my father, who worked for General Motors, his best friend in the factory was a Message believer. And that's about the time he drew my dad into the religion. And everything totally changed for us.
I can only imagine. That's also, again, a similar story. My in-laws, some of them are Wesleyan, and I could be wrong, but I think it's my wife's story. I'll let her tell it on her podcast, but something similar. Somebody met somebody at work, and that's how it's how it usually starts. Somebody says, "Hey, do you know there's a prophet?" And they don't tell you that not all of the prophecies were correct and all that. Just get you hooked, and then you get curious and you come into it. So I'm guessing your father got curious and brought the whole family along with him into the Message.
He did. He said that he always, being Baptist and in the way they believed, he always felt like there was something more. There was something more. And now that I'm older, I'm thinking, what more do you want than God's grace? What do you need? Rules to live by? What do you need? What do you need? So I remember when he started going to a small Message church, and my mom soon followed him. Of course, she was baptized right away. And that's when we had to start wearing dresses and couldn't do this, couldn't do that, couldn't. And it was kind of hard because going to Wesleyan school, they had their own rules. They had to wear long sleeves and always had their hair up, and just different rules and regulations. And we were kind of always the oddball, because here we had another set of regulations, and we were just, we didn't belong to their church, and they had their own group of people. So I always felt like an outsider. But all these years, I learned the Bible. I learned the Bible, and I just kept it in my heart. When I was in high school, we switched to a Pentecostal a Pentecostal school. Some things had happened at the Wesleyan school. So when I was in about ninth grade, we switched to a Pentecostal school, which was a little bit better for me. They weren't so rigid as the Wesleyan rules, but still, it was like all their women wore the same skirt, the same hairstyle, and we bought the same purse, and they all married each other. And it was just like, I just felt like I never belonged anywhere. We were just always the outsiders, always the outsiders. We went to such a small message church. There was no one, we didn't have many friends. So,
yeah, I can relate to all of that too. Some of I migrated with my family to various places around the country, and some of the churches were just a house with a few people in it. So I'm familiar with how that works, and I can't imagine, having been a Baptist and then heard the gospel, and the gospel in its simplicity, and like you said, wanting to learn more. The irony of this is you go to the message and you keep hearing that phrase, the gospel in its simplicity, but then they complicate it so much that nobody in it can really even understand what it is. And if you ask somebody what is the gospel, they never give you what the Bible says is the gospel, the good news that Jesus came. And so what was that like for you, being a person who reads the Bible? Were you able to detect anything that you felt was abnormal about the doctrine while you were in it?
I noticed now, let me clarify this. Sometime in that period when we went to the Wesleyan church, my dad's friend started pastoring a church. So we went with them. So it was two families. So for my entire life, most of my church was just our family and another family. This family had 4 children, and they felt like, me and my sisters did. Just, here we are. I started noticing things fairly young. There's a couple examples. One time we had some women come to our church. They just showed up one Sunday morning off the street and walked in, and our pastor, they were wearing pants. And right away, our pastor started preaching against, women wearing pants, they're going to hell. And I thought, and the women, they immediately walked out of the church. They weren't there 10 minutes. And I thought, how are they going to get saved? How are they going to know about Jesus if you condemn them in the first 5 minutes you know them? It was odd.
Yeah. In my high school years, we lived in a small town that really didn't have a church. As a teenager, I drove a long ways to go to the church in high school. But I grew up, reading the Bible, and I felt sorry for the people that would be lost. And like you, how can they be saved unless you tell them? So I told several people about the gospel, about the actual gospel, because I was reading my Bible, but I also told them about William Branham, because that's what we were supposed to do. And I'll never forget when I moved back here, and I was at my grandfather's house, which he was the pastor of the Branham Tabernacle, and some sales lady came to the door. I can't remember what it was for, but I remember the whole family looking out and seeing her and clearly saying, she has pants, we can't let her in this house. And I was just shocked, like, this is a pastor's home. And the thought hit me, even though I still was suppressing critical thought, I was thinking about the lady. If she was unsaved and he's a pastor trying to save her, why would he kick her out of her? Why would he not let her in the house, right? So that was one of the first few instances that I had of critical thought. But, looking back, there's so many things like that. It was not a message to a lost and dying world like most churches. It was a message to corral the people that you already had in your gates.
Right. And they do that with fear. And I think that's my main point of doing this with you, is the fear and anxiety that crept into my life when my parents started in the message. They taught me fear, straight up fear. The world's ending soon. You're going to go to hell if you do this, if you don't straighten up at school, and it was just, by the time I was 15 or 16, I was having panic attacks. And back in the 80s, they didn't know what it was. They chalked it up that asthma, maybe breathing problems. They really didn't know. They didn't have a name for it back then. Um, it was a terrifying, overwhelming fear. I sat in the pew with my kids when I was older. My two sons, they were very little. I clearly remember this. We were sitting in the pew and someone was preaching, and the man says, "You don't have a future. The world's going to end. These kids here don't have a future." And I remember that was the last time I ever went to a message church. I walked out the door and says, "I'm not going to raise my kids to feel like I feel. There's no way I can do this."
Yeah, I remember many, many sermons on that theme. What's interesting is a lot of the preachers will preach that theme, but they won't outright tell you you have no future. They'll just lead you to believe that you have no future. So as a child, you're living in constant fear because you don't know when it's going to end. And am I going to be at school whenever it ends? Can I get reconnected with my parents? That kind of thing. So back to the gospel discussion earlier. And in fact, I just had a call earlier today with a guy talking about this. The gospel that they give you is a gospel of fear, which is ironic because the word gospel, it just simply means the good news that Jesus came and you too can be free in Jesus. But what they give you is something to hold you captivated by fear. And the thing that it does, the worst part of it for me is it gives you it takes away your outlook in life. So as a child, there's no future. There's nothing to look forward to. Why do I care about this world? That kind of thought enters your head.
Yes, yes. I remember when I married my first husband, we moved to Texas, and I lived in fear. If California had an earthquake, I've had a panic attack, and I would call my mom long distance, to make sure my parents weren't raptured yet. There were times I would call their house at 2 o'clock in the morning and hang up the phone when they answered, just to make sure, I didn't miss the rapture. Everybody's still here. And what a terrible, terrible way to live. What a burden to put on children and young people, to give them no hope and just straight fear. The Bible tells us, 365 times to fear not? We were never taught that in church. I never heard that.
No. In California, Branham's prophecy of California sinking, I had to go out there on business, and I went out there, and everywhere in California, every day there are tremors. So you're out there and you're like, oh my gosh, am I going to live through this trip? And it changes. It's hard to conduct business while you're thinking this. I'll just say it like that.
It is. And I can remember one time I went out there to see a friend, and my dad, he would be like, I would rather your plane crash and you die than you have to California fall off into the ocean and you be there. And I'm thinking, where are you getting this from? What is your thought process? It's just the things I heard from preachers and people in the church. I just, something just didn't sit right with me. My mom would always tell me, like women with short hair, they were going to hell. If you wore pants, you're going to hell. And then as I got older, I thought, these women, I saw other women that were so godly, that had such godly homes and loved their families. And I thought, why do you think we're better than they are? I thought the attitude in the message is terrible compared to the attitude to a community church or such. It was, just didn't add up for me.
Yeah. And we recently went out to Los Angeles on just a weekend getaway. My wife had never seen the West Coast, so we went out there. And, the thought hit me while I was out there. I spent my whole life looking for Los Angeles to sink. That was part of the prophecy. But worse than that, we wanted it to. Every time that there's a tremor, you're kind of hoping that it does so that it makes this prophecy come true. But you're never really thinking about the people that would suffer and die if that happened. And many of those people are Christian people. So we were out there and, looking around at some of the people, you could see entire families, and they're good, really good people, right? And the fact that we cared so little about the people and cared more about the so-called prophecy, it made me realize that it wasn't even Christianity we were in. We were in something else.
Right, right. If it's true and we truly believed that it was going to fall off the ocean and millions of people were going to live, why wouldn't we be out there trying to convert them? Well, that's not how it happened. Not how it happened. Let's see here. I remember going to church camp. We had a fairly good sized church camp for the message in Ohio. I don't know if you ever heard of it or the people that ran it. My mom and dad were involved for a couple years running the snack shack and the kitchen. And oh, let me tell you, church camp especially for girls. Church camp consisted of church, doing nothing, and going to church for 5 or 6 hours. And that was our camp. And I could see other kids, as I got older, they would go to church camp and they would swim and ride horses and do archery. And I would be like, really? Why can't we do this stuff? Why can't we do? And I always questioned authority. My parents would tell you she really had a problem with authority because it just wasn't adding up for me. It didn't make any sense to me. We would, it would be nothing for our services at church camp to start at 7 and go all night. And if you didn't stay all night, you were looked down upon. But I don't know, John. I don't know.
I enjoy my sleep too much to do that. The funny part for me is I was never allowed to go to those things because my family looked down on the people running them. So I really didn't get a chance to go. My grandfather, in fact, you can listen to him say it on the resignation speech on the website, but his words were, if you can get to the children, you can get to the parents, and if you can get to the parents, you can get to their money. And that was, I can remember Grandpa clearly saying things like this all the time. And so they were so against all of these things for the youth, but I never got to experience it. And I
didn't miss much.
I wanted to. You'll laugh at this. The reason why I wanted to is because I read the Berenstain Bears books, and I would see all of the camping, the fun stuff they're doing with the canoes and the fishing, but I'm certain it was nothing like this.
Didn't happen. Did not happen. And another thing is, you couldn't find 3 families in the message to agree. That's probably why we never went to Jeffersonville or go to their church. We went one Easter one year to experience it and went to Voice of God. But, no one would ever agree. I think that's why my dad and his friend went out on their own to a church because they couldn't agree with 2 other people in the church we were in. And I'm like, why can't we just all get along? This is not what Jesus wanted. If you listen to Paul, he preached against that. We should all come together and be one.
And that's the real problem for people like you and I who have an analytical mind. If you're trying to think logically about this, there's no logic to it, and it doesn't make sense. And so internally you're told to suppress all of your questions, but internally they're surfacing, and it creates this big problem because now I've got questions and none of this makes sense. Why are these guys doing this? But the fact that they force an opinion is the bigger problem because people have differences of opinion, but yet you're taught to suppress the questions and you're not trained how to interact with people who don't share your opinion. And so what it ends up with is people get very angry with one another whenever they don't have the same opinion. And the interesting part of all of this is when we left the message and we started going to other churches, we would find that, one church's doctrine was completely different than the other one. That's why they're different denominations. But even in the same church, you would find, I would take the pastors and assistant pastors out to lunch sometimes and just ask them questions, and they would openly say, now, I believe this, and for me, it was like a core fundamental Christian doctrine. But he'd say, but the assistant pastor, he believes this other thing, and it was the polar opposite. But they were taught properly that people can have differences of opinion, and it took a long time for me to understand. what we were taught is to look very, very deeply into the little things and make it such that the little things mattered more than the big things. And so my focus was entirely in the wrong place. And through talking to these guys, I came to understand the little things that they're talking about, that they have differences of opinion, they really didn't matter. For me, they were core Christianity, but for most Christians, they didn't matter at all.
Right, right. It's like serpent seed. Some people believe it, some people don't. I struggle with the book of Revelation. I don't know much about it, but there comes a point where you have to focus on Jesus. Get saved, follow his way, and does these other things matter? We can debate doctrine forever, but as long as you are saved and you put Jesus and you seek after God, he'll answer. Because when I started this process, I prayed. I said, God, if the message is true, show me. If it's not true, show me. I just want to know. I just want to quell this in my heart once and for all. He showed me that it was false. It was a false way. I got married young, of course, because I wanted to go to college. Always dreamed of going to Ohio State. Of course, that's out for a girl. I wasn't going to live at home my whole life, so I married the first guy that asked. Was a horrible marriage. Out of respect for my boys who love their dad, I never really talk about it. We were married 10 years. Then we divorced, which is just a terrible thing for message people. It was about that time I took my boys and left the church. The day we left, I've never heard from anyone from the church ever again. Never. After going there about my entire life, never heard from anybody again. Kind of turned our backs on us. And then you're divorced, which is a double indemnity. They just, you're lower of the low. So I met my husband now, and I started telling him, it's hard to tell people, hey, I was part of a cult. Because it's, it's just like I have cancer or whatever, but to know someone who's in a cult, that's like, okay. So I tried to tell him a little bit about it, and he was the first person who used the term legalism with me. And he explained to me what legalism was, and it was like a light bulb went off in my head. I said, oh my gosh, why didn't they ever teach that we were legalistic? I never heard that term in the message. And that's what they are, 100% legalistic.
The funny part about all of this is, so I believe the message hook, line, and sinker until 2011. It wasn't until a trip to a revival in the South, believe it or not, that things started just really bothering me. And so on the trip, my wife we shared driving. So I would drive part of the way and she would drive the next. And while she was driving, I was looking up just things that were bothering me on the phone, things that did not make sense. And lo and behold, I found one of the earliest versions of people who were critically examining the message. And sure enough, there were other people that saw the same problems as me. And I began to look at it and, oh my gosh, they're right. There's a problem here. There's a big problem here. And so we get to the revival, and it's the funniest thing. It was a church I grew up in, parts of my life in the South, and it used to be a small mobile home. Everybody met in this mobile home, but they built this nice big fancy church, and they had a room underneath. You'd walk down the stairs under the sanctuary, and had a room for the men who wanted to take their children out of the building if they were being unruly. They could go down there. And we had a young child, so I'd never seen anything like this in a message church. Usually the women take the children. So I go down there, and my gosh, man, they had this nice big leather recliner that I sat in. They had Legos over here for the boy. I was on the screen on the wall. There was like a 50-inch screen of the platform, so you could watch the preacher preaching. And I'm sitting back here, my hands propped behind. This is great. I'm not going back up there, right? And
so you bribed your kids to act up in church, right?
Well, we were only there for like 2 meetings, but anyway, this preacher came in and he started preaching on legalism. And it was the first time I knew the term, but it never really clicked that that's what we were in. But he started just blasting the Branham Tabernacle, because there's different splinter groups of the message, right? So he was in one that hated the tabernacle and the main sect of the message. He was saying things that it was offensive to me because I came from the Branham Tabernacle, which, looking back, I look at this and I think, why did this man do this? Because half the crowd came from the tabernacle and he's just berating them, right? And then the irony is, as he's preaching against them, saying that they're so legalistic, then he starts into his preaching and preaches legalism. So the whole thing, none of it made any sense. And I was just sitting there looking at this big screen TV, and I thought, this looks an awful lot like those televangelists where the whole thing is fake. And that's when it really hit me. All of this, these people have this, a nice front. They look like they're Christian, they're playing Christian, but what they're doing isn't Christian. And that's when it really hit me. Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support.
I really started struggling with this last year, and I started doing some studying. Now, the thing we have today that folks didn't have back in the 80s and 90s is the internet. So whatever you were told, you believed. I started with, there was a man out of Lima, Ohio, who was a message preacher, and he left the message. And I read and I listened to his testimonies, and I thought, I knew him from church camp. So I went and asked my dad, did you know so-and-so had left the message a couple years ago? And my dad's reply was, well, he was always not right. He was kind of a womanizer. And I'm like, no. My dad looked at me like, how dare you say no to me? And I said, no. I said, I remember him from camp. He was a young man. I said, and the women, he was from an elite family, and the women would throw their daughters at him. Of course, they wanted their daughters to marry the elite people in the message. The bigger the name, the better the marriage. So, and I really started questioning. So then I started digging, like Florence Nightingale, was it her niece that supposedly got healed? And I found out Florence Nightingale never got married, and her sister never had children. And I'm like, is this a fake? I mean, is this can't be right. This can't be right. So I went to our pastor, my pastor I am now. We've been going to church for a couple of years, and he's a great man. And I said, I got a story for you. You're not going to believe this, but I think I grew up in a cult. So I told him a little bit about it, and he's like, Amy, this is one I have never heard of. So I said, he said, I'll get back with you. So he calls me the next day, and he's like, I got some information on you. So I started looking on the internet, and it's when I found out that William Branham and Jim Jones worked together. I was like, oh, this is bad. Yeah. This is very bad. This is, how close did we come from being a Jim Jones cult? How close?
I don't talk about it much because I can't prove this, but I've talked to many people who have escaped the message, and one family was from an area close to here. It was a little bit north of where we live in Jeffersonville, and they were in the message. I knew their whole family. I knew every one of them. And they told me that the only reason why they didn't go to Jonestown with Jones was because that their family had more money and they didn't want to go live like that. But they were so connected to the Branham Tabernacle and what was left there. And, when they told me, I didn't believe it. And I can't prove it, so, I can only take their word at it. At that point in time, I only knew of one mission that William Branham had with Jim Jones, where they went to the Cato Tabernacle and basically they launched Jones's career. I had not seen all the other information, and come to find out later, Jones was introduced by one of William Branham's primary publicists, Joseph Matson Bose, who he ran the Herald of Truth, and they connected with each other, and it looked like they were prepping Jim Jones to be a significant leader in this thing until an explosion happened, and Jones was sponsoring Branham's meetings in not just that one, but other meetings in even other states. So this was a big deal. And now, after knowing that knowledge, I look back at what that person told me, and I still can't prove it, but it's very plausible when you think through it. And Jones isn't the only bad fruit that came out of this mess, this movement. You can go through history and you can find one after another after another. And the Bible says, by your fruits you'll know them. By their fruits you'll know them. But none of the people are trained to examine the fruit, and that's the real problem.
Right. It's terrible to think how close some of us could have come to being part of that. It's scary. I tried to approach my mom and dad with my husband a couple months ago, and I told them, I said, I've been searching. I'm trying to get through this. I said, did you know about Florence Nightingale's niece? There wasn't, that was a picture of some woman from a concentration camp, God rest her soul, and Jim Jones, and they were livid. They said, you can't believe everything you hear on or see on the internet or hear on TV. You just can't. People just make this stuff up, so you won't believe in William Branham. And I'm like, there's documents, there's photographs, I heard a recording yesterday I was watching one of your videos, and I heard a recording of Jim Jones. I believe he was talking about Brother Branham dying in a car wreck in Texas. And I'm like, no, there's proof. Just look. And my family is so indoctrinated. Nope, no way. We're right and you're wrong, and there's no in between.
The problem is they've been trained so much to suppress the critical thinking, but more than that, they're trained to deflect it. So if you bring critical thought to them, they'll deflect it, and the easiest deflection is, it's all lies, don't believe any of it. So that's usually the position that they take. But inwardly, whenever you engage people like this, if you can engage them and they don't bring their guards up, in other words, you're talking about things that you enjoy, things that you have connected with them in the past, and in a non-confrontational way, just talk about Florence Nightingale. They already know this part, so you can't use that example, but talk about Florence Nightingale and the actual history without a confrontation. And so what happens is, the next time they hear that name, and William Branham claimed that he healed the Florence Nightingale. He later changed it to a daughter and then a granddaughter, I think. And once all of that was proven fiction, some message, I'm not going to give his name, but some message pastor out there said, no, he got it wrong, it was the niece. And so that's why you had to look up whether the sister had one, because they're just deflecting. They're actually producing more fiction to uphold the fiction. But if you give them just enough so that next time they hear it, they can think through it, maybe they can break through and hopefully escape this thing.
Yeah, I want people to know that it's just not the message. In my town I live in now, there's a Church of God that is a known cult, and these people wear, I call them uniforms. They all wear the same exact dress. It's either black or navy blue. It is so bad that they adopt children to get their numbers up. They don't try to recruit from the outside. They adopt children. This group was run out of Canada. and they came down here to my town and built a great big church. And I've heard rumors, can't prove anything of some things going on, but I know a girl I used to go to school with, she left it a couple of years ago and said it's definitely a cult. And we have a lot of German Baptist, Amish in this area, and I don't know what it is with me. I have a big problem with people who have to wear what I call uniforms. I don't get why everybody has to wear the same dress and in these rules and regulations. I see a lot of German Baptists. They won't drive trucks, but will drive tractors, or we'll have all this equipment for work, but our wives can't have a washing machine. And I just want people to know this is not biblical. It is not in the Bible. This is not, God does not require this of you. He requires your heart. Yeah. And I just want people to, if something seems off, go to the Word.
Yeah, I told you we went up to Ohio several times a year, and my wife is from Amish country, so she has a lot of Amish friends, and it's legalism, pure, plain, and simple. There's no question there. But I had never experienced Amish until I met my wife, and so we made a few trips, and I got to meet the really nice people. I got to meet a few of them.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I had just got a new Dodge Durango, and it had the big engine in it, the big 360 or whatever. And we made a trip up, and our first stop was at one of these Amish homes. And we pull off. It's always a long gravel driveway, so pull off on the gravel driveway. And the closer I got to the house, I feel the truck was like making a noise, and it felt like it was shaking. I thought, is that the gravel or is it the truck? And we pull up to the house, and I turn it off, and the ground's still shaking. And I'm like, what in the world is this? And I get out, and the closer I walk to the house, the more it's shaking. And so my wife and the kids, they go inside, everybody's greeting them. Hi, how are you doing? My curiosity is not like that. I can't just go in the house. I got to figure out what in the world is going on. So I start walking around the house, and I see this cable coming up out of the ground with a U-joint going in the house, and it was turning. So somewhere behind me in a barn or something was a massive diesel engine, and it was turning a thing for multiple houses. So I go inside. Hi, how are you doing? I still got to figure out what this is. So I walk to the back of the house, and there's a almost handmade built washing machine, because they're not allowed to have electricity in the house, but the men can run a diesel engine. So this guy had figured out that if he can pump the diesel engine, turn something, he can turn a washing machine. And so he did. And so I go a little bit further, and they said, well, it's hot outside. Would you like a drink? And I said, sure. And I'm thinking, I'm going to get hot water in this place. She goes up to her refrigerator, pulls it out, and hands me a ice cold Coke. And I'm like, how did you do that? Oh, it's a propane from a refrigerator. And I go further. I go into the living room, and I sit down. They got a nice recliner and everything, and I'm sitting there, and she says, oh, watch this, I got to show you something. And she flips a switch on the side of the thing, and it starts vibrating and gives me a massage. It's a massage chair that didn't even look like one. And I'm like, how'd you do that with no electricity? And I peer over the corner, there's a car battery behind me. But the kicker for me was when it started getting dark, and I was bored out of my mind. There's nothing to do in this house. They bring me some magazines, and I'm kind of thumbing through them. And as the sun was going down, it was getting dark in the room. And the lady comes in the room, and she says, what are you doing reading in the dark? And goes to the wall and flips a switch. And I'm like, okay. I figured out the washing machine. I figured out how did you do that? And she said, oh, we have gas all throughout the house, and when we flip it, it just ignites a little. They had every modern convenience that we have, but they're so legalistic that they could not, even though they're doing the same exact thing, they couldn't abide by the same rules. And we were still in the cult when all of this hit me, but that's the point at which I realized that legalism makes you do things that don't make sense at all.
None whatsoever. And there are German Baptist, Amish, this Church of God. I mean, it's funny. It's funny the things they do. They'll take we call it Papa and Mama. They go in every Thursday night on their tractor. They go into the local restaurant to eat, but they won't drive they'll drive a tractor, but they won't drive a car. And it's just like, oh, yeah, I don't know why people feel like they have to live by these rules. Now, I'm not saying it's okay to go out and live any way you want. That's between you and God. I believe God convicts people of things. Some people might have a conviction of going to bars versus not going to restaurants that serve beer, or women should have long hair, or everybody. If you ask the Lord to lead you, He will lead you. He will tell you what you should do. And that's, I guess, I feel I'm doing this for my grandchildren. I didn't want to speak about this because my family's still in the message. My mom and dad, both my sisters. But I see how they live. And their lives are a mess. My family's lives are a mess. But their theory is, as long as you believe in Brother Branham in this message, hey, it'll all be okay. It's not okay, and it's not good. And I see other people in the message, and things aren't going right, and they lose their kids. They go off and do these other crazy things, and they want to know why. They're like, well, we believe in the message. And here's a little story for you. My dad went to Amish country. Him and his preacher buddy has been going to Amish country to preach in an Amish church. They're converting the Amish now. I don't know. Maybe you'll run into them on your next trip. I don't know. So my sister, she texts me, and she says, hey, Amy, Dad's preaching and it's live. I'm like, we're at an Amish church and it's live? Okay, whatever. And I'm like, I was out mowing grass on a Sunday, God forgive me. The ox was in the ditch. It had to be mowed. So I took a break, and I thought, I'll click on here just to see what Dad's saying, because my dad's he's a pretty good preacher. I click on there. He was talking about me. So I listened, and he was saying, in the morning service, he got filled with the Lord, and he was dancing around, something he had never done before. And he said, it's because of my oldest daughter, Amy. She says she's a Christian, and she goes to church, but she just doesn't believe this message. And I don't know what to do other than to give it to the Lord to show her the way. And I thought, He showed me the way. He should pray for the right thing, Dad. Don't pray for me to believe this or that or another. Pray for me to know the Lord. I want my dad's prayers. I want my family to accept me, and I know so many others out there feel the same way. They're once they leave this message, they're cut off, or they feel like a second citizen, or the black sheep of the family. And it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be like that. I just want these pastors, and if anyone was to ever see this, know that we love you, and we just want you to know the Lord. We know that He's not full of, you do this, this, and this, I'm going to strike you dead. I remember when I left my husband, and our pastor told me, I know your husband's bad to you. Divorce isn't the only thing. We can turn him over to Satan, and I don't even know the theory now. Satan kills them, or they could die, or whatever. And I just looked at him like, I don't want my ex-husband to die. I just want to be away from him. I don't. So then that fear grabs your heart. Are they going to pray for me to die? Are they going to pray for, because I don't believe in William Branham? Are they going to pray for God to strike me dead? And it just doesn't, it's not right. It's just not right.
No. Placing a hex on somebody whenever they disagree is not a Christian thing to do, And that's the point I was trying to make earlier. If you have an analytical mind and you follow logic, well, to be a Christian means you follow Christ, which you do. And then whenever the people in the message see that you leave William Branham, they consider you not a Christian. And so the difference is, to them, Christian means following William Branham. So in other words, it's Branhamite. It's not Christian. It's following Branham. And if you follow all of this path out to its logical conclusion, it's a different religion than Christianity. It's not even Christianity. Otherwise, if you were to leave and follow Christ, they would celebrate your following of Christ, right? She left, but she's following Christ. And that's the real problem. They're manipulated to think it's Christianity, but they're in something entirely different.
Right, right, right. Absolutely. And last year when his son Billy Paul died, chirping crickets. No one's ever mentioned it. No one's ever mentioned it. When I found out he had passed away, I thought, I'm going to test the waters. I'm going to text my sister and see what she says. And I said, do you know that Billy Paul passed away? She goes, oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm like, does this change your mode of thinking? Because, God was supposed to come back before Billy Paul was an old man and California is going to fall off of the ocean. And she says, oh, no. And I'm like, has something changed that I wasn't taught? Were you taught something different? Did we not sit in the same pew? And she goes, no. She goes, that prophecy was about sharks swimming in the building, and that happened back in the 70s, and everybody knows that. And I'm like, no, I'm pretty sure. So, I get on the internet and I'm looking. I'm like, I don't see any proof this happened. Well, so-and-so said so-and-so's wife's cousin's brother's best friend worked there back in whenever, and it happened. And I'm like, if that happened, there would be, in the 70s, there would be pictures of it. Come on. It's like their whole, I don't know about your sect of the message, but ours was primarily based on the Lord was coming back before Billy Paul was an old man. Now that'll strike fear in you when you lay in bed at night and you're trying to figure out what's old. Well, it's not 60, okay, 65, 70's not old yet. What's old to the Lord, because this man's getting up here in years. Then he dies and it's like nothing. And I'm like, no, it's not me. It is your beliefs. It's not mine. So then I knew that was a nail in the coffin. I knew that this is not only is this not right, this is bad. This is a bad cult.
I grew up in the main sect, and then they would hold these revival tours where Billy Paul would be the speaker. And every minister who left those revivals, they came back and they preached for weeks on end about how he's our time marker. We know that the rapture's about to come because he is our time marker. And, for those who aren't familiar with this, the prophecy was that Los Angeles would sink before Billy Paul, William Branham's son, became an old man. And, whenever I heard this, I'm looking at a man who had gray hair, who was in his, what was he, 60s, 70s? I don't know. He was already,
60s.
Yeah, he was already he was past the age that most people lived whenever the alleged prophecy happened. So he was already well beyond an old man. And when we went out to Los Angeles, I paid to go see that building. It's kind of funny because the tickets for us to fly from Indiana to LA were cheaper than the cost from the LA airport to Uber to that building. Which this is a crazy world we live in, right? So, but anyway, I went to the building, and it's really interesting if you study the history of that, because you never really think about this, but he's there at May's department store. He's standing in the elite shopping district of LA. This is where the rich people go to shop. And he's claiming that he's so poor he doesn't have 2 pennies to scrape together. We didn't know at that time that he had millions of dollars, right? Back then in the message, I thought this was just a poor man, but what's he doing there? Why is he in the elite district shopping there? And
right.
And the fact that he had the prophecy, and I've got details of research on that. It's not the only problem with it, but when we left the message and I realized that all of it was false, all of this was fake, the thought hit me, whenever he dies, it's not going to impact them, because there are so many other problems with that story that they've shut off in their minds. They're going to shut him off too, and that's exactly what happened.
I couldn't believe it, because our beliefs was so based around that it would happen in the spring, and God would come back in the spring, and Billy Paul, it would happen before he was an old man, and I just don't know how they excuse that away. I can't get over that one. I just can't get over it.
Well, I'm glad that you were able to escape. I'm glad that you were able to find a healthy church to go to. And I'm sorry that you had to go through all of this. I went through it too, but I'm sorry for everybody who goes through it, because I feel somewhat responsible. My family helped create this mess. But thank you so much for coming on here and sharing your story. If there's some advice that you could give to somebody who's still in it, and questioning, like you and I have the critical mind, what would you say to a person who has a critical mind in this cult and is wrestling with the problems that are in it?
I would say to pray and ask Jesus to show you the way. He'll lead you in the right path, and that path might not be the same. It's different for every one of us. But I want people to know, if something looks off, if you go into someone's house who they say they love Jesus and they're a Christian, you don't see a picture of Jesus, but Brother Branham's on every table and on every wall in their house, something's not right. I have family, my boys are not Christians, they're not saved, they don't follow the word. I have, nieces and nephews who have married, who have never heard the message. So the only thing they know about Jesus is what's preached about William Branham, which makes them even more standoffish. So it's hard when it comes to family. It's hard when it comes to friends. You just need to pray and ask God to allow you to get your foot in the door, and at family picnics and gatherings and birthdays where you can be a witness, because you might be the only way they see Jesus is through your life. And they'll question, well, why does she or he live like this? And these people are all wrapped up in William Branham. If your first church experience is William Branham, you're not going back. I mean, I have a niece who's married to an Air Force guy, and he's been going to their church here and there, and I'm thinking, how can I tell him this is bad news, but you need the Lord? That's what we have to focus on. We need to pray. We need to pray for the children, because no child should be raised like this. None should grow up in fear with legalistic rules.
I agree. It's kind of ironic, because whenever I was growing up, I looked at the Amish religion and the Amish people, and I thought, well, they're not a cult because they don't have a central figure. And in my head, I was smart enough to recognize that. I was smart enough to recognize that if you're following a central figure, that is a human, you're in a cult. And back then, I didn't realize the attributes of a destructive cult. And, the Amish is in a much different category in my mind than it was back then. But even back when I was in the message, I realized that people who surrounded a human being and put him up on a pedestal and said, this is our leader, our precious brother, they all use precious brother. It's weird. I knew that, but yet I did it with William Branham, and I had disconnected it in my head. Like, I look back and I think, how did I not recognize that I was doing the same exact thing that I knew was a cult? And I had separated the two in my head. Right,
exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Well, this has been fun. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm glad that we connected. I'm glad we finally made it work. It's good to hear from you.
I will say this. Growing up, I almost wish my parents turned Amish, because they have such a big community. I thought I'd have people to play with. I have a nice big circle, and because they're so, their families are so big, and no such luck there.
Yeah, and I can tell you from experience, they have really, really good food.
Yes, they do.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. If you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more information about William Branham and the Healing Revivals, you can read Preacher Behind the White Hoods, a critical examination of William Branham and his message, available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.